broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by theunshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everyone and welcome to WilmsFront on this Wednesday, the 17th of March 2021. It is 8:30 p.m. here in Melbourne. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. Now, despite it being an Irish cultural event, it is celebrated here in Australia as another excuse to have a few or many or lots of drinks. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube and DLive channels and well on the enhanced software Entropy, where throughout the show you can send through a question or also send through a super chat. In Australia, the Me Too 2.0 movement, as I call it, still continues to dominate the political news cycle. The feminist left activists online in the media and out on the streets during the March for Justice on Monday, they're attempting to push a politicized narrative that the alleged mistreatment of women and instances of alleged rape, sexual assault and harassment only pervades the right side of politics and is caused by conservative values or traditional masculinity. Labor leader Anthony Albanese, in attempting to gain the political upper hand against Scott Morrison, has accused the government of not taking the issue of sexual assault and violence against women seriously, since he chose, Scott Morrison, I should say, chose not to attend the Women's March, though he did offer a private meeting with the organisers of the March for Justice. Now, Albanese even went this far in Parliament yesterday when responding to Morrison's now widely circulated comments in Parliament about the marches, that them being able to rally peacefully was a celebration of our democracy, as they were not met with bullets like has been occurring overseas. So this was Albanese's question here on the Tuesday Parliament question time,
where he said, "Not far from here, such marches even now are being met with bullets. But not here in this country. It is a triumph of democracy." Does the Prime Minister regret that comment, particularly on the second anniversary of the Christchurch massacre conducted by an Australian citizen?
Members on both sides. The member for Mackellar. The member for Mackellar. Members on both sides. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has engaged, I think, in a very unworthy and egregious slur in this place. Mr. Speaker, when has it been a bad thing for a Prime Minister to proclaim the strength of democracy in our country, Mr. Speaker? What issue does the Leader of the Opposition have with celebrating democracy and the right to protest, Mr. Speaker? What issue could he possibly have, Mr. Speaker, other than a twisted attempt, Mr. Speaker, to try and pervert what has been said in good faith in this place, to celebrate the fact that Australians anywhere in this country can come and express their concerns? This demonstrates, Mr. Speaker, that on this issue, the Leader of the Opposition does not act in good faith. He does not act in good faith. But on this issue, Mr. Speaker, over many weeks now, has simply tried to twist this issue for his own partisan advantage. He is proving himself unworthy of the office he even holds now, let alone the one he seeks to take.
Now, as the saying goes, those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, as there is plenty of misogyny and mistreatment of women on the left side of politics that has been documented over the years. Last night in the Parliament, the retiring Liberal member for Boothby, Nicole Flint, made an emotional speech recounting the gendered bullying and harassment she experienced during the 2019 federal election campaign, incited by GetUp, who are running a campaign against her in a marginal South Australian seat, given that she is a Conservative Liberal MP. So this was Nicole Flint's comments, or just part of her speech last night.
I say to the Leader of the Opposition, get your own house in order. And I say to the Leader of the Opposition, this can't be about politics anymore. We all bear the responsibility for change.
Now, Anthony Albanese and the most senior South Australian Labor woman, Penny Wong, have claimed that it's offensive that they were involved or encouraged the toxic campaign against Nicole Flint in Boothby, and Get Up has said it is part of an ongoing smear campaign against their organisation to allege that their members were involved in such a campaign. Earlier in the week, Labor female staffers also warned the party that they would no longer keep secret their stories of gendered mistreatment to protect the party. So we'll see what comes out of that threat, and whether there are any Labor male MPs or other senior party figures named in any such allegations. Now, on the COVID and vaccine front, we've been informed that by our federal government that Papua New Guinea is experiencing a massive spike in both cases and deaths. Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt has described the situation as a clear and present danger to Australia. Although the international borders are shut, many Australians are still travelling to and from PNG as mining FIFO workers, so our authorities fear that this could lead to a fresh round of outbreaks in Australia. So in response, the federal government is sending 8,000 doses of our AstraZeneca vaccine stockpile over to PNG. All Australian governments, or levels of government, I should say, and all health authorities are still 100% backing the AstraZeneca vaccine, despite the growing list of nations suspending the vaccine rollout over blood clot concerns. There is a theory that is going around that the European nations who have led the suspension of the AstraZeneca vaccine are deliberately undermining it due to the fact that it was a vaccine developed at Oxford in the UK as a form of payback from the UK leaving the European Union at the beginning of 2020. Now, these developments and concerns about the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is the vaccine that most Australians will be receiving, given that the federal government has procured 53 million doses of it, 50 million which will be produced locally at CSL in Broadmeadows. That hasn't stopped at all insane demand for the vaccine. On the first day that the wider populace can book an AstraZeneca vaccine appointment with their GP. There's been reports of websites crashing because of demand, and governments telling people to be patient. So we'll try to make more appointments available. So even though there has been these rallies against mandatory vaccinations, the vast overwhelming majority of Australians still can't wait to be injected with whatever COVID vaccine is available to them. Also, this afternoon, Victorian counter-terrorism police arrested 3 teenagers from the northeastern suburbs in regard to a potential Islamic terror plot. It took a bit of questioning by the media at the Victoria Police press conference to get that admission out of Victoria Police. If it was a far-right white supremacist plot, the Victoria Police would announce it immediately and keep on repeating that fact. Also breaking tonight on that front is Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, has said that ASIO is no longer going to use the term Islamic extremism or right-wing extremism, saying that those terms are no longer fit for purpose. So the new term is ideologically motivated violent extremism. So it's already a tongue twister there. So that's the new term for any type of extremism that they fear will lead to violence. Now, that's it for my news update for tonight. Now on to tonight's featured guest and topic. So as followers of the Unshackled and Unshackled Productions would be aware, we provide in-depth coverage of political events from our South Pacific Anglosphere neighbour New Zealand. The main forum for this is Trad Tasman Talk, which I co-host with Dewey de Boer every Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. Melbourne time on the Unshackled YouTube channel. Myself and Dewey, we get along well, both on and off air, and we have as you can see, have a good on-air rapport. But it's always good to get other perspectives about the news and political culture in New Zealand. Dewey, being a tradcon or traditionalist conservative, obviously has certain biases. So tonight we're looking at New Zealand society and politics from a libertarian perspective with my guest, Stephen Berry. He hosts the Mr. Berry show, and he has been active in New Zealand in the New Zealand libertarian movement for a number of years, and has also been a candidate of their Libertarian ACT Party in the past. It's one of the world's most successful libertarian parties, who returned to their glory days in the 2020 general election, winning 10 seats in New Zealand's 120-seat parliament. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I appreciate you coming on such late in the evening over in, well, you're in the glorious city of Auckland at the moment, where you can, or just like cities here in Australia, particularly Melbourne, you can be snapped back into lockdown at a moment's notice.
Yeah, and who knows when that's going to happen again. We've been surprised with 2 alert level 3s within 3 weeks just over the past month. So,
well, at least with New Zealand's alert levels, Jacinta Ardern, she has stuck to the various rules in the alert level processes, so you know exactly what the rules are going to be if you go to alert level 2, 3, or 4. Well, in Australian states and territories, whatever lockdown or restrictions, it's just made up on the go. They're never that there's never much consistency. They're never the same, and so I interpret the various restrictions as, say, level 2.9 or 3.8 or whatever.
we have had an alert level 2.5 once before, but I mean, weren't we all just making it up on the first lockdown anyway? Ours were actually illegal for the first 9 days. Yes,
well, there's been decent amount of challenges to both the Victorian prolonged 112-day lockdown and the state border closures, but so far none of it has found to be illegal by our courts. They don't seem to want to rock the boat on what they seem is a political decision with also implications with regard to health directives. So they've basically just rubber stamped whatever state and federal governments have done.
Yeah, but despite the consistency in New Zealand's lockdown approaches, it doesn't really sink through to the populace anyway. Every time there's a warning of an alert level change, the supermarket queues explode, and yet we know that supermarket trading isn't interrupted at all by these lockdowns. So I don't know whether it makes a hell of a lot of difference.
Oh, but there's still the panic buying before, in the hours leading up to a lockdown coming into effect. I saw with the latest Auckland lockdown, it's that your main supermarket over there is Countdown, which is, well, it's the equivalent of Woolworths over here. There were the people with trolleys all out the front wanting to empty out the place.
Yeah, exactly, and that doesn't seem to change any time, despite the consistency in the lockdown rules.
Now, your show is called Mr. Berry, Mr. Berry. Now, why two Mr. Berries in the title? Because it does roll off the tongue well when you say Mr. Berry, Mr. Berry. There's a lot of energy in it, and watching your shows, it starts you off on an energetic path.
Yeah, well, despite some accusations, it's not an homage to Pokemon, but it's actually about maybe 20 years ago when the Dr. Zayas Simpsons episode came out, it kind of got adapted into a nickname, Mr. Berry, Mr. Berry. And when I was trying to come up with show ideas about 12 months ago, that's the one that came first to mind. I think the most annoying part about the name, for me anyway, was having that theme song stuck in my head constantly throughout the day, and that's when I knew I had to have Mr. Berry as a theme song.
And then, speaking of cartoon memes, South Park during their 2016 election season had the member berries.
Oh, okay. No, I don't know anything about that.
You don't know the member berries because the reason that people were voting for in the South Park election, Mr. Garrison, who was the stand-in for Donald Trump, is because when eating the member berries, they remembered how good things were back in the old days, and the member berries spoke as well.
Oh, wow. Well, I've totally got to watch it now.
Yes, you do. I'm surprised you didn't know that.
No. You would think I'd be quite a close watcher of South Park episodes.
I guess that's you could call it an advantage or a disadvantage of having a fruit for a last name. My last name, Wilms. Well, a lot of people can't even pronounce that, but it's just a old school German name. There's not much else to it.
Yeah, and having Berry as a surname is, well, that didn't do me any favors in the schoolyard, that's for sure.
I could probably picture it.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of puns that you can make up with Berry, and most of them are not very complimentary. But I won't. I'll leave that for other people to do.
Well, you decided, as a lot of people who are disparaged in that way, to just own it and make it your own.
Yeah, so I guess I should be glad that I'm not called the C word like another one of our politicians, because I wouldn't want to have to own that one.
I think there's a lot of politicians who are called that word.
Yeah, she's not special.
But the show title I settled on tonight, I thought it had to be a berry pun, so I chose Liberty Berry as a pun for Liberty Bell.
Oh yeah. That's well chosen. But yeah, I couldn't really think of any myself, so I even Googled it.
Now, first before I proceed with the next question, a super chat has come up on the Entropy YouTube enhanced software from Senator Slayer for $5 Australian, and he says, "Great show, Tim. I'm sure you'll get more success after your recent changes." Yes, if you're following the chat, and if other regulars are, I decided to unban a few people. Well, unban a person with multiple accounts, just to sort of, mix up the chat a bit. Let's see if that experiment is a success, but it's certainly a lively chat.
Yeah, it seems to be moving well.
Now, let's talk about, I introduced the party in my introduction, the ACT Party in New Zealand, which, as I said, it's one of the world's most successful libertarian parties, and it returned to the New Zealand Parliament with a strong showing after a period in the wilderness. And my basic analysis of it is, when a nation is turned into a police state, when other freedoms are on the chopping block, and the nation's economy is going back on the road to serfdom, then the general public, who basically took a lot of their existing freedoms for granted, they see merit in, we did like that liberty, and are more open to voting for a libertarian political party.
Yeah, and it started with the free speech issue in 2018 when Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux visited the country. They got kicked out of the Bruce Mason Theatre by
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, Phil Goff claimed it was his idea, but it was actually already decided before he opened his mouth about it. And that was the first liberty issue that really captured the public's imagination. There were a lot of free speech examples going over that 6-month period. We had Chelsea Manning, Nigel Farage, Dom Brash, Clementine Ford, who I find quite horrendous, all very different characters, but ACT was actually the only parliamentary political party that stood up for free speech for all of them, whereas the other parties had their own personal prejudices. National was very vocal on behalf of Dom Brash, their former leader, very quiet on others, and actually openly hostile to Chelsea Manning. So that was the first liberty issue that really helped ACT. And then the really horrendous process on the crackdown on guns in New Zealand is what fed the rest of ACT's explosion in popularity. David Seymour was the only person in Parliament who would have voted against it going through the emergency process. Unfortunately, he missed the vote, but there was a bit of trickery going on between the Speaker and the Labour Party, and he was standing outside talking to media when the vote should have happened. But that doesn't seem to have really impacted on ACT's support as a result. In fact, perhaps it even did it some favours because there was so much focus on the one MP who stood up against the rest of the mob in Parliament. In terms of more people being attracted to a Libertarian Party, ACT's a bit of a conundrum in the sense that it's a Libertarian Party, but its membership is conservative. And during my time in there, I would often notice the difference between the leadership and the board and the candidates versus its members. But it's probably a combination of ACT being more visible on freedom issues, but it's also what tends to happen in New Zealand's political environment when the National Party goes through a dark period and the smaller right-wing parties then go on the ascendancy. And we saw the same thing in the late 90s when MMP first came into New Zealand. ACT had its best result in 2002 with 9 MPs when National had its worst result ever. Then in 2005, National was on the ascendancy again with Dom Brash being the leader, and ACT only got 2 MPs.
I went to New Zealand, well, when we did have free international travel during the 2017 general election, and I have to say during that time I wasn't that impressed with David Seymour and ACT at that time. He seemed quite cringe and he was trying all these different sort of stunts to get noticed, but he's really blossomed, you would say, or risen to the occasion to stand up for freedom. You mentioned because you, I recall, had tickets to go and see Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern there, and you didn't get to see them in Auckland. But obviously, the Christchurch massacre in March 2019 changed a lot because it was perpetrated by an Australian. There was a lot of scrutiny and calls to crack down on nationalist and far-right groups in Australia. But over in New Zealand, well, Jacinda Ardern said pretty early that she was going to make New Zealand gun laws the same as Australia, and well, also crack down on free speech as well. So that's when David Seymour and ACT, pardon the pun, got their act together. And in 2020, he was one of the lone voices against the Ardern government's tyranny when it comes to the lockdown and their various mismanagement.
Yeah, and that wasn't unique either. The ACT Party was the only vote in opposition to government votes, at least a third of the time in Parliament. The Child Poverty Bill would be another example. Not very well named because all it's done is measure the increase in child poverty. But my issue with National for many, many years has been that it's indistinguishable from Labor. It's probably the more competent version of the Labor Party. And I guess it was inevitable that voters would eventually identify that, especially once the centre-right went into opposition. There's usually a trend in New Zealand politics as well, with the exception of the Greens in 2020, for junior coalition partners to get decimated in the following elections. And that was definitely an issue for the ACT Party. When they went into coalition with National in 2008, there were 5 ACT MPs. Then in the following 3 subsequent elections, just 1 MP each. So going into opposition was probably the best thing that ever happened to the ACT Party in 2017, I think.
Now, the ACT Party, it has been a political force for nearly 3 decades now, emerging from the beginning of New Zealand's foray into mixed member proportionate. But the reason it was probably able to achieve such a comeback is because, well, it had strong foundations, that it was founded by key players in New Zealand's revolution in the 1980s, away from socialism towards libertarianism, notably the Labour Finance Minister Roger Douglas and his, well, you could call him his right-hand man, Richard Preble.
Yeah, and that was part of a movement that was taking place globally, really. The UK, Australia, USA, Eastern Europe, to differing degrees, all went down the same path towards the more free market approach. And why would you not, looking at the absolute catastrophe that government bureaucracy was across the world? Problems with excessively strong unions, government ownership of just about every utility, controls on the volume and the amount of goods that you could bring in through a border. I mean, I could never possibly list all the crushing regulations that impacted New Zealand economically, and the same around the world. So as we've gotten further down the line from that past, so that's almost 40 years ago now that Labor government was elected, people either have short memories or they weren't even alive at the time.
Both.
Now, so now people are quite happy to bag on Rogernomics and the market experiment, but nobody's happy to go back to 6-week waiting lists to get a phone line, or regulations on how far trucks can travel on the motorway in order to boost volume of goods on railways, etc. So in 1996, people remembered what a difference the free market reforms had made to the long-term prosperity of New Zealand, despite the initial tough times, which always happens when you remove an artificial distortion from the economy, such as a government of that size.
The reason why it's called a revolution in New Zealand, and you're right that it was a free market revolution across the Western world, but New Zealand went from the absolute most highly regulated, centrally managed economy without actually being openly socialist communist to pretty much by the mid 1990s one of the most free market places, dare I say, libertarian paradise. And it was continued in the early 90s by the national government, which is the centre-right party of that nation, by 2 women, because New Zealand is known for its female leaders, and they're on the right as well. Ruth Richardson, the finance minister, with was dubbed Ruthanasia, and Jenny Shipley as well, who was it social services minister?
Yeah, that's right.
But achieving, because she brought down Ruth Richardson, what was called the mother of all budgets in 1991, which cut welfare significantly. And I was sort of thinking 30 years on, there's no way that you could deliver a budget like that today in this age and be able to sell it and implement it.
I think that's been the case for all the big free market reforms in New Zealand. The 1984 Labor government didn't run on a free market platform during that election campaign. It had no idea what a mess the government books were, and nobody knew because the government wasn't required to publish the books at that time. So when they were elected, they inherited a broke government, a foreign exchange crisis, the need to devalue the dollar by 20%. So basically everything that they'd run on in that election was thrown out the window, and for the better, of course. And it was the same with the national government that was elected in 1990. They didn't run on the mother of all budgets. They ran on getting rid of the superannuation surcharge and returning to a decent society where the government wasn't so cold and clinical. Yet, once elected, they did the complete opposite, and thank fuck for that.
Though the national prime minister from that time, Jim Bolger, he's mellowed in his older years now and says that neoliberalism has failed and we need to give power back to the unions.
Yeah, what an idiot. Maybe he's just got soft in the head as a result of more government handouts, because he's worked for New Zealand Post now. I believe he's worked for Kiwi Bank. And then he was in the Working Party, in which they were deciding how to return employment relations back to the 1970s, in which all industries were required to negotiate together to achieve single level playing field of conditions. So it's just like, the Organisation for Dentists has spoken up in the last couple of days about wanting a sugar tax. They're not politicians, they're not economists. They should stick to teeth, because all they really have in this argument is their handout for some government money, and that really changes people's outlooks on life, I think.
We had a former Liberal Prime Minister over here, Malcolm Fraser, who had a similar mellowing in his older years to Jim Bolger. Malcolm Fraser, I think his last act before he died in 2015 was advocating the re-election of Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young.
Oh, how ghastly.
Yes. Now, in Australia, our main libertarian party, which is the closest to libertarian values and principles, is the Liberal Democrats, or Liberal Democratic Party is their full name. Obviously, they burst onto the political scene with Senator David Leyonhjelm, elected in 2013, and he was quite a polarizing person, not just in the media, but amongst other libertarians as well. Certainly he was my type of libertarian, and so I certainly enjoyed some of his antics, but he left in 2019. There were two Liberal Democrat MPs who got elected in Victoria in 2018, David Limbrick and Tim Quilty. And Victoria, as you're well aware, is known as the Socialist People's Republic of Victoria because of our far left socialist premier, Dan Andrews. Now,
well, the education state, the number plates tell me.
Yes, there's been lots of puns on that. The lockdown state. I think one of our slogans was also the smart state. I don't think that's true either.
Margaret Thatcher always said, if you have to tell people you're a lady, you're not.
Well, what's a lady anymore? Yeah, it sounds like Margaret Thatcher was ahead of her time in that regard.
Definitely was.
Well, they didn't get much traction for the first year and a half of their election because basically it was just business or government business as usual. The local media basically doesn't ask many tough questions of Dan and his government, and that was until 2020 and until the second wave and 112-day lockdown caused by the Andrews government's incompetence with hotel quarantine, and since then, David Limbrick in particular have received both extensive coverage and extensive praise, particularly from the new freedom activists here and anti-lockdown activists here. And Tim Quilty, he is from the border, Victorian border city of Wodonga, which borders on Albury in New South Wales. And so for a lot of 2020, that those twin cities were divided in half. And so he was very good at advocating for, like, look, you've got Wodonga, which is completely locked down and then had ridiculous mask rules, and that, while Albury, it's pretty much everyone's just getting on with life. So they've certainly, I believe, followed the Seymour model in, but it also takes rising to the occasion as well, because you have to remember that the lockdowns and the follow the science, follow the health advice is still incredibly popular. So even though a lot of libertarians have their principles and values, there are still plenty that are too scared to proclaim them loudly, especially during the pandemic. So it still takes both a charismatic and principled politician to get the message out there and grow a libertarian party.
Yeah, Seymour's been a bit disappointing on this issue to me. He's actually advocating for compulsory contact tracing.
Yes, I saw that.
Bluetooth. I mean, I guess it's tempting in this sort of situation when opposing lockdowns is such a desert in the wilderness for politicians. So, yeah, I'm not going to be that critical, because he is obviously a politician and that's the way it works over there. But I mean, it can be very counterintuitive to advocate for freedoms that we have enjoyed and should continue to enjoy, when it seems so logical from a voter's perspective that people staying in their homes while there's a pandemic going around the country probably will stop it spreading. My concern is always that when the pandemic goes away, how many of those freedoms are we going to get back? I would argue not all of them. Even in New Zealand, under level 1, which is the lowest alert level, you now have to wear a mask on public transport, and that's just been accepted. And it started off just in Auckland. Now that's around the entire country. Same thing when you're flying in a plane around the entire country now.
Yeah, same here in Australia as well.
Yeah, and it's a small thing, and you look like a jerk for opposing that, because the general consensus is that a mask will make it less likely that you'll pass on this disease. But that's always the tricky thing for libertarians, because politics isn't about principles or anything. Well, nothing like that at all. It's about popularity and votes. And on the whole, voters are very trusting of their democratic governments in the West. Too trusting.
Yes. Even still, a year later.
Our governments do have a good record on not overextending their hand unless it's seen to be absolutely necessary. I mean, in World War II, we accepted food rationing and conscription. And then things returned to much the way they were once the economy had recovered from World War II. And so I guess that's kind of the same mentality that we're seeing with COVID as well. These restrictions look reasonable to people. They've lived in a system in which the government has generally been quite reserved in exerting power, despite the fact that New Zealand's a unicameral legislature and there's very few checks and balances on our parliament. So they don't see danger in being over exuberant about squashing out COVID with legislation.
You mentioned, and I already knew that David Seymour was advocating for compulsory QR codes, and this is the sort of a trade-off that has been sold to Australians that to avoid lockdowns, this centralized QR code system is the best way, and this is why New South Wales under Gladys Berejiklian has been able to remain open, because they've got this centralized QR code contact tracing database. But I get the suspicion, the fact that David Seymour proposed that obviously he's buoyed by the ACT Party's success, and he is feeling that, hey, maybe we could become the official opposition. And so obviously if you have to do that, you have to go a bit towards the centre.
Yeah, I mean, ACT's been a much more effective opposition than the National Party since since 2017, when both of them were thrown into opposition. One MP against another 119 scored some remarkable wins, and the euthanasia law changes that were passed into law in the referendum last year stand testament to his abilities, and that of Brooke Van Velden as well, who is now deputy leader, but at the time was working on his parliamentary staff. But I guess you've always got to keep expanding your I think it's called a minimum winning coalition of support. Clearly, there's a limit on how far gun supporters will get you, and free speech supporters, and you've got to be looking for other ways to expand the tent. Taking an extreme libertarian approach on lockdown politically is probably one of the stupidest things he could possibly do. So yeah, it's not a huge surprise to see that he's gone down this path on the compulsory contact tracing.
It's not unreasonable to, I think, say, hey, we shouldn't lock down over one case, which, well, Auckland has done, and so have various Australian cities as well.
Yeah, and if you have a look at the anti-lockdown movement, most of the personalities don't, let me put this tactfully, they don't appear to represent mainstream New Zealand. They've been holding liberty rallies against the lockdown, and my first instinct was, oh, awesome, the movement's going to grow. And then you see those rallies, and the last thing you would want to do is to be seen by somebody you know standing next to one of those people.
There is also the argument that a libertarian party should have should be open to as broad a base as possible, and not always so conscious about media optics, because, well, it's obviously the most important thing for political parties, the basics, is to remain registered, make sure that there's some finance coming in, especially towards election time. And so you don't want to exclude a vast majority of people, even some people who'd necessarily be fringe, because there's libertarianism being a political philosophy. There's people who have also, since it's only a political philosophy, there's people who have all sorts of values, all sorts of views, and this is also why a lot of libertarian parties fall apart or just go in one direction and alienate everyone else.
Yeah, because the entire party looks like an anti-lockdown protest. But having been now being retired from politics, yeah, I've been in the position of wanting to keep your party and its processes and its policies as pure as possible, but accepting the political reality that 99% of voters don't actually know what a libertarian is, and they really don't give a fuck how consistent the philosophy of the party that they've never heard of is. So there's a political reality and compromises that have to happen all the time there. But at least, now I get to point it out without getting in trouble.
But if you take Ron Paul, for example, he created what was the first libertarian moment worldwide. He still was open to going on Alex Jones's radio program, who even back then was, he still had quite a significant media presence and was described as a person who never seen a conspiracy theory he didn't like. But for Ron Paul, like getting the message out to an audience and speaking to somebody who was somewhat sympathetic, even though he believed in all of these conspiracies, was still a net gain.
Yeah, Ron Paul's was quite a uniquely American phenomenon, I think. I guess we have our Vinnie Eastwood would be our Alex Jones equivalent in New Zealand, and I've worked with Vinnie in the past too, because there's things that we agree on, especially when Auckland was rocked by its pants down Len Brown mayor in 2013.
Oh, what was that? Tell me more.
Oh, so just a few. So I ran in the 2013 Auckland mayoral elections. And about 2 days after the results were announced, it emerged that Len Brown had been screwing one of his aides in the town hall. And I believe she was also running for a local board in that election too. So that just exploded 2 days afterwards.
Well, sex and politics are a perfect mix.
Yeah. And he wouldn't resign, and there was no mechanism to make him resign in Auckland either. So for the next 3 years of his term, there was always this thing hanging over him about being the filthy mayor who screws around with staff in the office. So not nice to be him, that's for sure.
Well, we're stuck with Daniel Andrews as Premier, who's, screwed Victorians for the past year until November 2022, when the next state election is due. I think you're referencing there's no recall mechanisms in Australia and New Zealand. But thankfully, we don't have to see Dan's mean mug on the TV since his fall and trip down the stairs a week and a half ago. He's out of action for at least 6 weeks.
But you mentioned Ron Paul before, and I got all excited about the prospects of libertarianism in 2011 during those primary campaigns as well, and that's when I got back into politics after a hiatus of about 6 years. Ran as an independent in Tamaki on a highly libertarian, pure libertarian platform, thinking if I just spent enough money, that might make all the difference, and it didn't. It was the worst result I've ever achieved. So I came to the conclusion that Ron Paul is a uniquely American phenomenon because of the history that America has, being founded as the closest we've ever seen to a libertarian nation in human history.
I look at it differently in that the same way that the ACT Party capitalized on the rise of big government and the suppression of freedom from 2017 to 2020 and went from 1 MP to 10, Ron Paul in 2008 tapped into the war fatigue that America was experiencing after the Bush war years, also the war at home, the drug war, the fact that U.S. police SWAT teams were overzealously policing drug possession, and also the financial crisis, which he pointed out that no, it's not these. It's not capitalism that's run amok. It's you've got to look at what the Fed has done during this time. Because to my mind, libertarianism only becomes appealing in a crisis point, when there's a crisis and a libertarian party or candidate politician says the reason things are this way is because of this, and then there's more light bulbs or revelation that go on in people's head. That's sort of why I put down to Ron Paul's popularity in 2008, which lasted until about 2015 over in the US.
Yeah, and in New Zealand, the national government dealt with that by maintaining social spending and running deficits for 6 or 7 years, and I guess, experimented at a stage with liberalism on drug laws. It was a weird middle position, having no official political party, but having everyone who's publicly associated with the party speaking in favour of drug law reform. And Don Brash in 2011 brought up the issue of legalising cannabis during that election campaign. Putting those issues together with a libertarian party with a conservative membership actually really hurts the party. And I found in subsequent elections, the euthanasia issue really did hurt ACT at the polls. What few support it was attracting at the time was also really muddied by people who would otherwise be considered traditional ACT voters being put off by liberal comments on cannabis or euthanasia.
And the cannabis referendum that failed to get up in 2020, I was informed by Dewey that was basically because the legalized cannabis campaign, it was basically that meme, dude, weed, legal weed, which doesn't really wash with the majority of citizens of any country.
No, the Prime Minister wouldn't back it. She only admitted to supporting it after the vote had been lost. I agree with those who say that her refusal to be committal probably did hurt the referendum. But the law that was being proposed was an absolute mess anyway. It was over-regulated to the point where you could barely see the benefit in legalising it because there's so many bloody regulations to comply with. But even the regulations we knew about were just a small part of the speculation on what it could end up being, because a lot like Brexit, this was being voted on before we even had a concrete objective idea of what it would actually mean.
Now, with the ACT Party going from a sole MP, David Seymour, to 10, obviously there's these 9 new strangers in Parliament advocating for they're the most closest to libertarian advocates in the Parliament now. How does that? Because I know that when MMP was first introduced, and you have what is termed party lists, where MPs are elected as basically agents of the party. There was, what's the word for it again, when they quit basically within 6 months and formed like another. Yes. So now there's legislation to deal with that now, but that still doesn't prevent basically a new MP getting a big head thinking that they can run the show and freelance and do whatever.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the legislation's still in effect. Don't hold me to that. And previously it's been introduced. That was at the behest of the Alliance Party early in the century. as a result of their party falling apart due to defections. And New Zealand First brought it back in 2017 because they had been destroyed by defections in the past as well. So I'm not sure if it had a sunset clause this time, though previously it has done. But yeah, it's a little bit tricky in the sense that as a list MP, you're really elected by the party as opposed to being elected by an electorate. So how can you claim to be elected personally and then go and be independent of the party when you've been elected on a party list? There's always that sort of conundrum in it, and I guess you could make a strong argument for the claim that these list MPs are really hamstrung by being on the party list and almost obligated to vote with the party each time and not rock the boat. But I don't want that from a politician elected into Parliament. I want them to do what they think is right, even if it is stupid.
Now, how are lists, party lists decided? So the 9 new ACT MPs, how did they get elected to their positions on the party list, which ultimately saw them enter the Parliament? How does the internal democracy work?
For each party, the Greens have a highly quota-based requirement for their MPs, which must also be voted on the party list by the membership, and they have to have a certain proportion of Māori, gays, women, men, blah, blah, blah. The ACT Party system, they do have a member ballot where the members can vote, choose their top 20 candidates for the list, and that's taken into consideration when the board decides what the list is going to be. But then ultimately the board makes a decision on who the list is. Legally, parties are required to have some sort of democratic system for creating their list, but it doesn't specify exactly what it must be.
Who elects the board of ACT?
The party membership does. I think there's currently 7 board representatives plus the president, vice president, and the party leader. There may be I think there's probably an MP representative as well, but that was never an issue during my time. And they're elected for 2-year terms, and ultimately the board makes the final decision on what the party list will be.
In Australian political parties, it's basically up to the parties themselves how they govern themselves. They can either be completely democratic or they can be extremely highly centralized in it's called executive in Australia, and obviously there's different sorts of indirect democracies as well, where you elect a delegate who then elects a candidate, goes on, so forth, and that internal party democracy and voting. That's almost as contentious here in Australia as actual voting.
Yeah, and the Australian system is already extraordinarily complicated from an outsider's perspective. I mean, I'm extremely interested in electoral systems, and I find the Australian system quite confusing, especially because there's actually multiple different voting systems per state, per council.
Yes.
Federal elections, and then it's compulsory. And I'm going, why the fuck would you want to force people to participate in this extremely confusing exercise? And then you end up with, I don't know, the old automobile party or
motoring enthusiast party. That
That's
was
good,
the 2013 federal election, which was the last federal election where the senators were elected with what's termed group voting tickets, where you put most voters just put a 1 above the party box rather than filling out 1 to 78, and the party decides who the preferences go to. And so all the minor and micro parties were all doing preferences with each other in the hope that one of them would get elected, and obviously some parties were better at doing the preferences than others. And if you were able to employ the service of Glenn Drury, who's known as the preference whisperer, he would be able to make sure that if the stars aligned in a particular state or Senate region, you could get elected even if your primary vote was only 1%. So yes, in that 2013 federal election, that Ricky Muir from the Motoring Enthusiast Party in Tasmania, that was also the election that Clive Palmer got four senators? Three senators.
Sorry, wasn't the guy from One Nation who then defected to form the National Conservative Party?
Fraser Anning, yes. He was elected on a countback. Because he was elected on a countback, he was third on the ticket, so hardly anyone voted for him below the line. But because enough voted for One Nation above the line, and he was next in line because Malcolm Roberts was found ineligible during the dual citizenship crisis, which, what was it? A New Zealand Labour MP was accused of being part of that plot to, what was it again? Asking about Barnaby Joyce's citizenship, or sort of asking without asking.
Yeah, so you've got a very complicated political system, which is then compulsory for people to participate in. You have a hard enough time working out what the policies are of 25 different parties, on top of remembering what their preferences are.
Well, it's only the Victorian upper house and the West Australian upper house which still have those group voting tickets. Now, at the federal level, it's optional preferential in the federal Senate. So above the line, you can number 1 to however many above the line, or you can number below the line, and it's optional. So you can go 1 to 6 above the line, or 1 to 12 below the line, or number them all if you like. But that also, because a party basically has to get close to a full quota to have any chance of being elected, which is 14.3%. The only winners last federal election from the minor party scene were One Nation, Malcolm Roberts returning to the Senate, and Jackie Lambie, who, well, she got elected via Clive Palmer's United Australia Party in 2013, then defected, did the, what you call it over in New Zealand, I can't pronounce it, and became an independent, formed a Jackie Lambie network. And so she's been able to gain her political following off his coattails ever since.
And before the show, I was discussing how much I like the political culture in Australia. It's very bold, it's very blunt, it's quite offensive sometimes, which
it's also much more toxic, and the cultural left have the ascendancy. And if you saw my introduction, you'll understand why. This is despite the fact that supposedly most of our media is owned and controlled by the evil far-right News Corp Murdoch media empire. And apparently that's why New Zealand politics is so kind with prime ministers like Jacinda Ardern, because there's no Murdoch media over there.
Yeah, well, there's not a lot of media competition at all. And what there is receiving bailouts from the government as a result of lockdown. Another $50 million over the next 3 years was announced this year.
And I'm not sure if you followed in Australia how the Morrison government went into bat for the mainstream media and extracting money from Facebook. Facebook they have now made deals with the Australian media companies to pay them for for Facebook providing traffic to the mainstream media websites. You see how perverse that is.
Yeah, I did. I was aware of that. I didn't follow it too closely. I think there's probably arguments for both sides in that one, in terms of Facebook being able to generate traffic for itself by providing those links. But yeah, it's not. I'm not going to die on a hill over that.
Well, I won't get a check from Facebook, and Mr. Berry won't. Well, it's a New Zealand publication.
No. Well, God, I got to make sure I'm still getting checks at all, and that I'm not deplatformed by YouTube.
You didn't get any of the sweet bailout money.
No. I just got banned by Twitter.
Yes, because when I was preparing for the show, I clicked on all your links, and then I clicked on your Twitter and said account suspended, and I was thinking, what did you do?
I shared some tweets questioning the election result, just initially.
Oh yes, which election result?
Well, the US presidential election.
Yes,
result.
very bad.
Yeah, capital crime on Twitter now.
Yeah,
so,
I'm surprised you didn't get sued for $1 billion.
Oh, that would be fun, wouldn't it? But going off topic a little here, but the cancel culture is something that I think the right is getting very, very wrong in politics these days. Freedom of speech is not an entitlement to a platform, and deplatforming, as much as I generally hate it, because the people that do it are generally wankers, it is really free markets at work on a social level. It's private property rights, it's freedom of association, and it's still freedom of speech, because one of the things that I mention when I sell freedom of speech these days is that whether you like the speech or not, you've got the freedom to criticize it, to highlight it, or to boycott those people who use it to say things that you disagree with. So I think that the centre-right has really got it wrong in its opposition to cancel culture.
I believe in fostering a culture of free speech, not just standing for the free speech in principle. And that was one of my motivations for starting the Unshackled, is because I wanted to report the news, interview people who weren't being fairly covered on the mainstream media. And yes, that inevitably got me smeared by guilt by association. There's this Labor Senator Christina Keneally, who she's called the Unshackled, both an alt-right media platform and far-right media platform, because I've interviewed these all these people who've been declared extremists. But if we don't defend free speech for, I don't like the word extremists now because it's so overused. If we don't defend free speech for radicals, I think that's a better term. Then eventually, if the radicals are silenced, cancelled, then they're going to come for the people closer to the side that is in the minority.
Yeah, and when free speech took off in New Zealand, I spoke at the first rally defending Lawrence Southern and Stephen Molyneux's right to speak. And, there were people at that rally that I definitely do not share political ideologies with. That we would generally be quite opposed to each other. I thought that was the whole point of speaking at a free speech rally. I was more than happy to speak at a rally attended by people that disagree with me. That's the whole point. But of course, then the lazy left instantly said, "Oh well, you're a right-wing extremist. You're a white supremacist." Having a homosexual, being homosexual with a Filipino husband just as the equivalent of saying I have black friends.
Well, you look at Andy No. He's a gay Asian who's dedicated his life to exposing Antifa, but he's like literally the Antifa and the online communist #1 enemy. They've showed up to his house, tormenting him, bashed him in the street. He certainly doesn't get a pass.
No. And it's really just speaks to a decline in political articulation that I think has started with the universities. We saw this happening 6-7 years ago in the States, possibly earlier than I saw it, and I thought it was another uniquely American thing, but we've found that over the years, New Zealand tends to be about 2 or 3 years behind these, and now we're also burdened with the SJW cancer, and it's also made its way into our parliament, and it's become popularised amongst young radicals. Whereas, I remember when I was young, being in favour of free speech was popular and radical.
In Australia, the centre-right, the Conservatives, they do put up a reasonable fight. Obviously, there's still some mainstream media which can be quite radical from time to time, such as Sky News Australia commentators such as Alan Jones and Rowan Dean and Rita Panicky. But there's certain, obviously, they have their limits. The Sky News Australia, they should obviously they should get credit for having Lauren Southern as a contributor, despite constantly the Antifa activists saying, look, she's doing the okay sign with these local white nationalists during her tour. How can she be on Sky News? How can Barnaby Joyce be on the same panel as her? And so that not all hope is lost that she's still on Sky News, and they can't stand it, and Sky News isn't caving in and cucking.
Yeah, and I guess there's always going to be a market for that sort of approach, and thank fuck for a free market in the media, because the profit motive is probably one of the best defences we've got against the government tyranny.
Unfortunately, though, that free market that free market doesn't work as it should be, because it's being manipulated somewhat by these Antifa groups who just bombard various advertisers and companies with tweets and emails and that. And so the HR managers, usually some young woke person from university, are like, oh shit, there's all these, we better cancel this person's account, disavow them, and that, which is not the free market working. That's it being manipulated. Like the people who say, I'm never going to buy your pillows again, they probably never bought any of their pillows. But a local small business, say for example, which is targeted, you had like the Proud Boys like dine in there, like, and they get all these negative reviews, that they generally freaked out by that, and don't know what to do in that situation, because they're suddenly getting all these negative reviews, and that's a manipulation of the market.
Yeah, well, defamation isn't part of the free market. It's not a legitimate part. It's tricky in the sense that defamation processes really only protect those who have the financial means to prosecute them, unfortunately. But I guess it's one of the tricky things for libertarians when speaking to non-libertarians as well, is the argument that something doesn't work, but you've got to define what work is. And another Achilles heel for libertarianism is that work is usually defined by the means, not the ends. So if everyone gets fat because they eat shit in a free market, that's actually the free market working, as opposed to everyone making healthy, rational choices that are good for them.
Well, in that regard, the market tends to, well, people correct themselves by, yeah, like it's not fun being fat and lacking energy. And so
Yeah,
now
and having to pay your medical bills.
yeah, and so now we've
Yep.
seen the massive explosion in 24-hour gyms all over the place. Nearly every suburb now has a 24-hour gym.
Yeah, I have faith in the market to correct eventually, but you're always going to get some negative results which require the correction. The most important part is to ensure that the market is actually free enough to correct, as opposed to, say, the housing market in New Zealand, in which it's distorted by over-regulation, planning rules, land supply rules, blah, 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 blah. And then people propose more regulations to deal with this market that's not working.
Now, even though libertarian parties are gaining more traction and more people are rediscovering their ideas of liberty, they're still, to use the current phrase, overwhelming majority of people in Western nations are sheeple and are just happy to comply with the lockdowns for because it's based on public health advice. And this is the other thing, the tyranny of the medical experts. Politicians justify these things. Well, it was advised by the public health team, who are unelected people. They may be experts in certain fields of medicine, but that shouldn't give them the right to make decisions for millions of people. And this was played out in the WA state election, where, as you can see, Labor Premier Mark McGowan currently on 51 out of 59 seats, Liberal Party on 2, National Party on 4, and Aaron Stonehouse, the Liberal Democrat from that state, doesn't look like getting back in the upper house.
Yeah, and this is quite dangerous in the sense that if you have a particular qualification, voters will, on the whole, unquestionably accept what you propose. Maybe I'm a little biased because I never went to university, but as climate scientists, we need to tax these activities and bring in regulations on other activities to stop climate change taking effect. I don't question your nous when it comes to predicting the weather, but knowledge of climate does not equal being an economist or a politician or a policy expert. And it's one thing to know that hot and cold results in a particular sort of weather. It's another thing entirely to know how to use public policy and regulation to achieve a particular type of weather.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you, Stephen. I know it's getting close to midnight over in Auckland there. It must really, I think, suck that when the clock strikes midnight in New Zealand, the rest of the world is just getting up.
I think that's probably why we have so much ingenuity, because we've got about 10 hours ahead of everyone else.
Maybe. So your show is on YouTube. It's a pretty easy search. Just Mr. Berry, Mr. Berry.
Yep, there's only one of it.
which is always good if you have a unique thing, and so it's just impossible for the algorithm to hide it.
Yeah, I guess I like to call it New Zealand political comedy. Maybe I try to do too many things and do an average job of them all. People will just have to search for the show on YouTube and make up their own minds. Yeah,
and I'd encourage them to do so, because the show, it's full of berry energy. It's a high-paced, enthusiastic show.
Yeah, well, that's after years of saying what I was expected to say, and now the freedom of saying whatever the fuck I like.
Yeah, you're unshackled, to use a pun.
I certainly am.
All right, take care, Stephen. Hopefully I can meet up with you in person if this trans-Tasman travel bubble ever gets up and is not ruined by one case here or there.
I'd look forward to it.
All right, everyone, that's the show for tonight. Now, just some important news. Thirsty Thursday with the Dusty Bogan, which I've been co-hosting in 2021, that is now on an indefinite hiatus, as Dusty is going to focus exclusively on his Censor.tv content. I don't plan to put a new show or another existing show on that evening. I will from time to time maybe put an extra, say, WilmsFront episode on a Thursday evening, but for now I'm happy to take most Thursdays off. I certainly want to, as you will have noticed on the Unshackled, I haven't had the chance to do much writing articles lately because obviously the shows are my focus. So if I'm not doing a show every Thursday, then there's more chance for me to do some written analysis as well. But obviously still doing WilmsFront at least once a week, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on WilmsFront YouTube. The Brawl in the Brain with myself and Jared Seaby, now permanently 8:30 p.m. Sunday Victorian time on the Unshackled YouTube channel. And as always, Trad Tasman Talk, 7 p.m. Tuesday, Melbourne time with Dewey De Boer on the Unshackled YouTube channel. And the Unshackled YouTube channel is also where you can find regular reports from Tiger Mountain with Richard Wollstonecroft as well. Keep visiting the unshackled.net. It's got our archive of both written and show content. And please follow me on Telegram, Gab, and also I'm uploading the WilmsFront archive to a new video platform called Odyssey, which Dewey is also introduced me to. Blair Cottrell is uploading his new lifestyle videos there. So watch this space for that, and I'll start linking to it once there's a decent amount of content there. Remember, if you want to support the work of the Unshackled, if you don't want to send a super chat through the show, you can go sign up for membership at theunshackled.net/membership or donate at theunshackled.net/donate. I might have a WilmsFront show tomorrow night if the stars align with a certain high-profile guest who I've been trying to tee up for a while, but you'll be the first to know if that is happening there. I'll post it on my Telegram and Gab there. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next show.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting theunshackled.net to view all our shows and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.